There's no difference in aptitude at the end of the
Right.
day. Women are certainly just as capable, and according to some studies, maybe even more capable with money. I think the perspectives are different. So men tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused on things like rates of return, the stock market. It becomes a bit more of a measuring stick. The accumulation of money is the target. Women tend to be more worldly and more holistic. I've never really heard women talk about money like men do. They're not saying, oh, what's my rate of return?
Do you think money takes up more life space than it should? On this show, we discuss with and share stories from artists, authors, entrepreneurs, and advisors about how they mindfully minimize the time and energy spent thinking about money. Join your host, Jonathan Dio, and learn how to put money in its place and get more out of life.
Hey, welcome back. On this episode of the Mindful Money Podcast, I'm chatting with Ed Vargo. Ed is the co-founder and CEO of Burning River Advisory Group and enlightenHer, a community focused on financial mentorship for women. With over 20 years in financial services, Ed helps women navigate long-term financial planning for all stages, including retirement and transitions related to divorce or spousal death. His dedication is personal, inspired by his mother's financial struggles after his parents' divorce. Ed's committed to empowering women with the knowledge and confidence to avoid similar hardship. He's also, to his credit, and this has got to be harsh, he's married with 5 daughters. So ages, I think, 18 to 24 and 25, something like that, whom he has raised to be financially empowered young women. Ed, welcome to the Mindful Money Podcast.
Glad to be here.
First, tell us, where do you call home? Where are you connecting from?
Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm actually just a little suburb outside of Cleveland. And, I've been here basically my whole life since I was about 2 years old. That's all I know.
So born where?
I was born in Milwaukee. My father was in the Army, came back. He served in Korea, where I met my mother by chance. And they got married over there, was stationed in Milwaukee, which is where I was born when he came back. And then he moved back to Cleveland when his tour ended. So, yeah, I've been here since 74.
74.
So it's been a while.
Oh, we're the same age. You must born 72 then?
Yep.
Okay.
72.
I was born 71. I'm a year older. That's why there's gray. I don't know if you grow it out, what happens, but I got.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm with you.
I'm curious. You probably didn't learn anything in Milwaukee, but when you were in Cleveland as a young lad, what did you learn about money and entrepreneurship?
Honestly, it's more about what I didn't learn. I grew up in inner city Cleveland. My father was a steel worker. My mom was an immigrant. She didn't really work at that time. And so we grew up poor. Poor, blue collar in the city. Everybody was kind of in the same boat. So you didn't really notice like how really poor you were. And I don't mean to overstate it, but we were, blue collar, struggling to get along. And the money lessons that I learned were they're more kind of like negative money lessons, what not to do. My father wasn't good with money. He went through a few bankruptcies during his time. There was collectors, I guess, I don't know how common that was, but that's the world that I grew up in. And so that's how I started out my sort of money journey. I guess we all have a place where we start from. And then, of course, I'm in a very different place now, being in the money business, but you learn a lot from coming from those two different worlds. You really can appreciate the spectrum and the struggles that so many people have, especially, again, I'm in a different place today. And if I didn't have that experience growing up, I don't know if I'd have quite the appreciation for what it means to be, true blue collar, paycheck to paycheck kind of stuff. And, how things like inflation today can really impact, your world.
I'm wondering if you can point to like a specific experience. You're 9, you're shopping with mom, or you're looking at a new car with dad or something like that, that sort of builds an early building block of how one should deal with money, or how your parents modeled money for you.
Yeah, again, in my household, there really wasn't much modeling of money. Not in the sense that it was never a conversation, or if there was a conversation about money, it tended to be negative. My father's not with us anymore, but one of his issues was he always had a difficult time with money. He just did. And so what I grew up in a household where money was talked about like in a very negative context. And so those who had money were kind of like, they were bad people, or they must have been like doing something wrong, or they only focused on money. They only cared about money because they had money. And so that was his way, I think, of dealing with his own inefficiencies and inadequacies with dealing with money. He kind of pushed it off and said, hey, those people must be bad people. They're only focused on money. They have this big house and all these different things. And he was not that way. And so he was more, I guess, pure, or took
Yeah.
like kind of a moral high ground in that regard.
Yeah.
And so that's what my upbringing was like. And so it took me a while in getting into this industry and this business to kind of shake that, and not to prejudge others just because they had more.
Yeah. I was actually
And
wondering, as you told the story, I'm actually kind of wondering if you had any guilt about sort of, because I know I'm in the industry too. I think we get paid ridiculously well for what we do. I'm always sort of advocating for lower fees and reduced compensation for advisors. But I'm wondering if you had any guilt in that whole process of sort of engaging the money world and the advisory space.
yeah, not really. I can't say there was any guilt. I think my relationship with money was very much, it literally wasn't a relationship. I didn't shun money. I didn't have like a negative or positive connotation toward it. I was very indifferent, quite apathetic. I don't know if apathetic is quite the right word, but I really didn't engage with it. I never sought it out, even as an advisor and, getting into this business. Of course, we can make good money in this industry, and you're working with people with money. Money was never a motivator for me in that regard. And so I never assigned a value. It was always fairly neutral. And that has helped me in some instances and it's hurt me in others. So I haven't had any real guilt with it. And I didn't grow up like my father did, in the sense that I didn't look at those who had money as being bad or evil or anything negative, unlike my father did, but I also didn't embrace it either.
Yeah.
And that's where that sort of lack of connection with money hurt me, because I should have embraced the learning about money much sooner. I made a bunch of mistakes, right out of college. I had no guidance, none of that stuff. And I'm not blaming anyone. It's just how it happened. But I made a ton of mistakes, So as an advisor, I feel like I'm in this, even having grown up with that in those circumstances, right? Very poor, not learning about money, making a ton of my own mistakes as a young adult coming out of college, and then having to work through that and kind of right the ship and then come into this financial services industry. I mean, I kind of run the full spectrum. And now, of course, thankfully, I'm on the opposite end of that spectrum, and I'm trying to model good behavior for my girls. And, my story, so to speak, really starts with my parents, but really with my mother's experience. And then carrying that through all the way to now with my girls' experience, and what I'm trying to model for them and trying to put them on a very different path than I was on.
So before we get into the work, tell us a little bit about those struggles your mom went through post-divorce.
The heart of the matter was, my mom was an immigrant from South Korea, couldn't read the language. Couldn't read or write. Still really can't to this day, but it was much more problematic then. Really wasn't working at the time, has never driven. And, but she was, raised us and taking care of us. And then when the relationship fell apart, she really didn't have any economic mobility. She really had nowhere to go. And there's a cultural difference there as well, of course, coming to the United States by herself with no other family members. So it was a lot to ask of a young person at that time to do that. Fast forward to when they got divorced, she just didn't have any economic mobility. And so she gave up custody of us 4 kids. My father had sole custody, raised us, which was quite unusual at the time. I think divorce was not what it is today, certainly not as well accepted. And to have a single parent household being the father was also unusual. But really, she had to give up custody of her children because she didn't have the money to be able to take care of us, or didn't feel that she would be in a position to, raise us on her own. And that's kind of when I think about that story, it sounds like it's not a good story, to say the least, right? It's a pretty devastating thing for a mother to have to put herself in that position, or feel like that was her only option. And it took a long time for me to realize that that was her situation and the case. And it really does color my thinking today. When I think about the work that we do, and we work predominantly with women, both on the, Burning River Advisory Group side and on the enlightenHer side. And that's, I think, where it really comes from. My mom's experience, and just trying to make sure that no woman that we come in contact has to make those same decisions that she had to make.
So I want to get into this, but I want to note just right up front that it's a little fraught for 2 guys in financial services to discuss the difficulties that women have with money. It's a little fraught, but let's do it anyway. So in your experience working with female clients, why is it so difficult for women to talk about money with their partners, for example?
Well, that's a loaded question, I guess. I think it's twofold, right? So the backdrop to this is, I think that women and men approach money differently. I think that's not just societally. I think that there is, from a psychological standpoint or a predisposition and this comes out of the scientific and psychological literature, not my not my take on it, but just what the data suggests, is that men have a tendency to gravitate toward things and women have a tendency to gravitate towards people. And you can see this with your own eyes, right? There's so many more female nurses, right? There's a reason for that, because women gravitate towards other people. And then there's so many more male engineers because, males tend to gravitate toward things. And it's exacerbated on the extremes, so there's a lot of overlap between men and women, of course, but on those extreme ends, you do see women gravitate more toward people, and then, men gravitate towards things, and money in and of itself is a thing. And so I think very naturally, because I've wondered about this for a long time, like, why do men, this is my early, when I was first starting to sort of dip my toe in the waters of working with women. It was an evolution. It happened over time. And I was learning about the, female psychology and how women think about money. And again, in contrast with how men think about money, because there's a difference there. And, I just started to learn more why men were just so much more confident and engaged with money than their, female counterparts. I found that interesting. Like, it just seemed time and time, the interactions I had, the males, even if they had no training, right? No understanding, they just inherently felt, this is on average, by the way, I'm not talking everyone, but on average, it's skewed to the men were like more confident about money, more willing to engage with it, and just almost had like this idea that they should know about this.
I've read some of the same studies, and the thing that I found most interesting is that the ability levels are very similar, but men are more confident. And so there's this overconfidence bias. I've actually found women to be, I don't want to say smarter generally with money, but a little bit more like, let's not drastically overspend. Let's not chase the new thing, and let's save, and let's make sure we have some emergency fund. And let's make sure we have some good plans. So it seems like they're really smart about it, but they're still lacking that confidence. So I think you're just about to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, there's no difference in aptitude at the end of the day. Women are certainly just as capable, and according to some studies, maybe even more capable with money. I think the perspectives are different. So men tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused on things like rates of return, the stock market. It becomes a bit more of a measuring stick. The accumulation of money is the target. Women tend to be more worldly and more holistic. Instead of I'm saying something like, I've never really heard women talk about money like men do. They're not saying, oh, what's my rate of return? How are we doing against the S&P 500? What's our benchmark? That's a very male-centric way of thinking. And it's also a very financial services industry way of thinking, which we can have a whole conversation about that. But for women, it's well, what is this money going to do for me? So that's primary, that's front and center. The byproduct is, I need a good rate of return. I need to take the appropriate amount of risk. Those are secondary, whereas those are primary for men. And for women, again, it's more about the goal. What's the purpose of this money? Am I going to be able to educate my children? Am I going to be able to have work-life balance, retire on time, do those types of things? So they're coming at the problem or the issue of money. Men and women are coming at the issue of money from very different perspectives, very different lenses. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at why women don't engage with money as much, I think there's just that. Again, just biologically and naturally, women are less of a predisposition toward things, AKA money. And so they're less inclined to engage with it. And so that's sort of the nature side of it. And the nurture side is that the financial services industry has not done a great job of making money accessible to women. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. Just a practical reality. When you think about how the money industry, Wall Street and everything that goes with it grew up, that whole industry grew up, our industry, it was men selling to other men, because that's who had the money. That's who was in the workforce, right? So naturally, the marketplace said we need to create dialogue and language and everything else that resonates with men. And that's what's happened. And it works very well. So if I'm a male advisor talking to a male client, there's no bridge the gap. We kind of look at things very much the same way. The language is geared toward how men think. And so that's why there's so many charts and graphs and rates of return, which is all connecting with the male mind. And then as women have gained their economic power over the years, and now they're a force in the marketplace, but we still have this legacy language, right? You can't just change the language of finance overnight. And you can't just, and then the male industry, financial services industry is very male dominated, right? So, and think about the industry again as a whole. We have successful men in the financial services industry working with other successful men in their world. Everything's working just fine. So there's not a whole lot of impetus to make changes. And now, women are coming along and they have their own economic power. But if you're the male working in your industry, in your business, and you've got to change the whole way that you interact with this other market, and you don't really have to do that because, you're doing just fine as it is. It's kind of hard to teach an old dog new tricks.
It's also very interesting that, and this has changed a lot over time. But I remember going to conferences, when I first entered the industry in like 1996, and 99% men were the advisors. And now it's more like, I don't know what the number is, 70%. It's still a lot of men. You go to a conference, it's still mostly men, 75%, maybe even 80%. But there's inroads, and there's definitely been opened up for more people. This is 15, 18 years ago, and I'm wondering if you've ever heard anything like this. I also have a majority of female clientele. And one woman came in and she said to me, Jonathan, I decided you were the right woman for the job. She hired me because maybe of the men she interviewed, I was the gentlest or the most planning oriented, least things oriented, maybe. But what do you think the difference is for a woman hiring a man or a woman hiring a woman to do this? Because now they have that opportunity. I know a lot of women look for women. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's natural for a woman to seek out another woman in this area because I think there are stereotypes about our industry, right? Or women's experience with working with male advisors, even if it's on the fringes, a male banker or someone at their workplace. The reality is that I don't know if most advisors come across the right way when they're in front of women. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong. I'm not saying they're being anything. They're just conducting themselves using normal financial advisor speak. But normal financial advisor speak doesn't work with women clients. It just doesn't. And so you don't have to, I'm not saying you have to dumb it down, use different language or anything like that. What I'm just saying, you have to kind of use different language, but your approach, how you approach the problem, the issue.
You're not talking about returns, you're talking about plans. That's
Yes.
exactly my experience. Exactly.
Yeah. And so I haven't found it to be a barrier or a gap at all in terms of like women wanting to work with, myself as a male. Now, there are some women who definitely want to work with a female advisor. No problem. In fact, my business partner, she's a woman, so that helps us, right? So that's not a barrier in working with our practice. But what I found is most important is really, what is the nature of the conversation? What are you talking about? Are you listening just as much as you're speaking? Are you providing information in a way that is pertinent to that person, where they are in their life and how they look at the world? Or are you sort of trying to cram down some information because you think it's important? And so I've always focused on the planning side. The reason that I think we grew and we evolved into working primarily with women wasn't because I had this great idea that's what I wanted to do. It's because I talked about the work that we do in the context that resonated with women, planning in mind. What do you want your money to do for you in life? Money is not the most important thing, And so I have a way of explaining sort of like a hierarchy. You're at the top of this hierarchy. Your goals, your vision, your dreams for tomorrow. Your money is a servant of you. Your money needs to serve you and serve you well. We don't want that money to be a master. And so when we look at money in the context as servant to me, serving my needs, I think that resonates with women. And then for a lot of men, to contrast that, it's easy for me to go in and talk about money, like put money at the top. I'm not saying they're motivated mostly by money, but the conversation is different. I could say, hey, we're going to focus on the rate of return or these investments, and here's what it's going to do for you. You have to turn that on its head when you're working with women.
What are some of the money scripts and how can we change those money scripts? You talk about these in some of your writing.
Yes, I think that's a very important. You asked me the question about what was my experience with money growing up and what type of modeling behavior were you exposed to? And my answer was what it was. I didn't really have very many positive role models, but I think that's an important piece because you do create your money scripts when you're in younger part of life. And you may not even be aware of this. Most of these money scripts happen below the surface. So as an example, we still see this a lot. And I haven't gotten to the heart of the matter as to why this is, but women are just definitely less likely to talk about money, even to other women, than men are to talk about money. There's something going on there. It's something like, maybe it's rooted back in the days where mothers said to their daughters, well, we don't talk about money. That's rude if you talked about money. And that's an old school mentality, but I think those threads have long legs. They just live long. And so you still see this lack of engagement with money. And so women have now how do you learn about something? Well, you have to engage with it, talk about it. But if you've grown up your whole life, even if it's not overt, and said, this is just something we don't do, we don't talk about money, then how do you engage with money later in life? It's much harder to do so. And so I think there's also part of money is math. right? And so, here's a stereotype: women don't like math. But again, that's the gravitating towards people versus things. So there's the math of money can be intimidating. The language of money can be intimidating. So, you just there's a lot of avoidance beneath the surface avoidance. And I don't think a lot of women like articulate that or really think about it in that way, because they know the importance of it. And women clearly know money's important, but there are some money scripts that are basically holding them back from engaging with it.
I go back to this idea of overconfidence, and there's some sort of advantage in just believing you're smart about something, even if you're really stupid about it. I've met, and you've probably met many men in your practice as well, that they're just power ahead. Like, yeah, I know how to do this. Like, I'm trading options. Sure, I can do this. I'm literally having this conversation with a client this last week. And I'm like, no, don't do that. That's crazy. You're going to hurt yourself. Oh, well, you do it for me. I'm like, no, that's not what we do here. Trading options is not a good planning tool, right? But there's this idea that if I project that I'm good at the thing, I'll be good at the thing. And it's better that you don't have that. And I think it actually favors women in this a lot. I don't know if that you've had similar experience.
Yeah, for sure. And so again, going back to the scientific literature, and I'm sure you know all about behavioral finance and how that manifests itself in the real world behavior. And so at the end of the day, men have a behavioral bias, like cognitive bias, and overconfidence is one of them, just kind of in general. And it really shows when it comes to money. I'll use the opposite end. You're very right. We see a lot of guys, especially when I was first getting into business, and we met with a lot more men at that time. There was this sort of almost a bravado about it. Almost like I would get into these stump the advisor conversations. Like literally the guy would come in. I'm thinking he wants guidance and help and support to see if we can help him. And it sounded more like he wanted to show me how smart he was about money.
Yep.
Right. There was an ego that got involved, and you don't see that with women in money.
Right.
Now, I'm sure it happens in other areas, like we're all humans, but it definitely doesn't happen with money. And so there's this inherent sort of overconfidence around money. So my part of the story was this guy came in and he was like beating himself up because he didn't know about money. It's like, I don't know this stuff. And he was like really down on himself. And I stopped him. I was like, well, have you ever had any training in money? Have you ever been taught this at all? Gone to school? Or he's like, no. It's like, so why do you think you should know this? You've never been taught, you've never been trained, but he in his mind thought he should know this. He should by the gods, bestowed with this financial knowledge. And who's kind of sheepish coming in and having this conversation. And so again, that's just an example of like, why do men think that way about money? But they do. There's this overconfidence. And to your point, there is a benefit that you can derive from that.
Yep.
Right. Because where it might be a barrier for women to say like, I'm going to tread lightly, I'm going to go more slowly, more cautious, which is prudent in many cases. But there is something to be said with like powering ahead, say, I'm going to go do this and see what happens. And we see this a lot when it comes to like pay raises. They've done tons of studies, of course, and I'm not going to go down this path. It's a much different conversation about the sort of the gender pay gap. But one of the factors that's been cited is that men have a tendency to throw their hat in the ring, even when they don't feel they're ready. So They may not be ready for that promotion, but they're like, I'm going for it anyway. And sometimes they get it, right? Sometimes they get it. And then women, to contrast that, might be more cautious about it. But like, no, I'm not quite ready. I'm just going to wait, get my skills up. And when I'm ready, then I'll go apply. But then you got this guy who's not nearly as skilled or as talented or whatever. And he throws his hat in the ring and he gets the job and he gets paid more. And so that if you accumulate that over time, it can cause a considerable gap between, person A and person B.
For sure.
And so there's a lot of behavioral stuff that goes on, like this nature stuff that can hold women back again in terms of taking these steps when it comes to engaging with their money. But when they do, you've mentioned this a number of times, when they do, they're very successful. And again, in some studies, they show they may be even more successful when they do so.
So I want to kind of go back to your family a little bit. So with a wife and 5 daughters, how are you as a family sort of making really good spending decisions? How do you do that? And then how would you teach others?
So when it comes to teaching about money, my kids definitely have a benefit. They're growing up in a household with a financial advisor, father, right? So they're going to naturally know more about the ins and outs about money, but we never really have those kinds of conversations. Like I've never sat down with them. I shouldn't say never. I have one story to tell about that, but there's not like a lot of money conversations. Like, here's how money works. Get on a whiteboard, show them all these different things, right? There's no technical conversations. And my girls are between 19 and 25 right now. So they're very young and they're not going to, pick up on a lot of that. And now they might be a little bit more so, but certainly in their upbringing, we didn't have those conversations, but we modeled the right types of behaviors. And the conversations we had, we would never shied away from talking about money in front of our kids. We always talked about money in the way we wanted them to hear it.
Mm.
Right? So when my father talked about money, he talked about it in a way that was, I would say, not positive. It wasn't the right message I should be hearing. And he wasn't like necessarily talking to us about a lot of this stuff. We were just in earshot. But as a kid, you learned so much just by listening in on your parents' conversations, right? Sometimes you take those more at face value because you don't feel like they're lecturing you or talking to you directly. So we wanted to leverage that. So we would have these money conversations about a topic. We might just manufacture a conversation about spending as an example and create this message talking, just the two of us together within earshot of the kids. And so they're picking it up, kind of behind the scenes, and they're building their own money scripts based upon that within earshot conversation.
You did that intentionally.
Intentionally, yeah. I can't say always, but as I got further into it, yeah, intentionally. And, you think about these teachable moments. And so teachable moments come up where something just happens in your life and you're like, oh, I have to be cognizant enough to make this a teachable moment, right? It happened. And then but it's there. Then I could present it to my kids and say, here's how you learn from this. That happens quite a bit.
Can you give us an example? Like how did that conversation go? You and your wife having a conversation, the kids are over here in the back.
Sure. Yeah. So there's two ways to do this. So there's the teachable moments that are thrust upon you. So we get in a car accident as an example, fender bender. This happened to my wife last night, little fender bender. And that's a moment to teach kids about what happened. How do you engage with the police? How do you engage with the insurance afterward, right? That's a moment that is thrust upon you. And so we were always very aware about taking advantage of those with money and everything else. Because as a kid, of course, they don't know anything. You've got to teach them everything. But when it came to money later on, as I got a little bit smarter about this, I created the teachable moment. So instead of going to my kids and saying, hey, let me talk to you about this values-based spending. I wouldn't use that terminology with them, but we would talk about values-based spending. We would create this moment. So it might just be my wife and I sitting on the couch talking about money. And the kids are in the room doing their own thing. And then we would just talk about, how we think about money. Let's talk about values-based spending. And so you asked, I think a little bit earlier about what are my beliefs on spending or how do we control spending, those types of things. One of the things I firmly believe is, and I'm not the first one to come up with this idea, but I spend a good amount of money on things that are really important to me, that are of value to me and my wife. And I spend very little, if not anything, on those things that don't. Yep. So as an example, we've always gravitated toward doing things with our kids, creating experiences, whether it's travel, even local stuff, little staycations kind of thing, creating experiences with our kids. But we weren't real big on buying a lot of stuff. So we don't have the latest and greatest iPhone. We don't have, fancy cars, things of that nature. And there's nothing wrong with those things. They just don't align with our value system. Instead of trying to tell that to our kids, like, here's what you should value, or here's how you should think about money, we would just talk amongst ourselves between the two of us about how we think about money, what's really important, why it's important to us. And then they'll pick up on that if it resonates with them or not. So we weren't forcing the issue, right? We weren't like having a lecture, you need to believe this, because obviously when you do that, at some point kids rebel. Yep. But they could take it in. They could take it in without feeling like it was forced upon them, form their own opinions about what they had just heard, and then go from there. And if you do that often enough and you reinforce it through your behaviors, next thing you know, you have kids that are doing the behaviors that you want them to do without having ever had a real conversation or a big, long conversation about it.
You're tying meaning to money through life. I think that's one of the most powerful things I've heard. I've never heard of anyone actually having the intentional conversation with their partner in front of the kids so they absorb that conversation without talking at them. That's a beautiful idea. I hope everyone on the podcast is listening. That's a great idea. Everyone should try to do that with their kids.
Yeah, we do that a lot, not just with money, but other things, And the more sensitive the topic, it might be even more important because emotions get high, right? So if we get into a conversation about a sensitive topic or an emotional topic, emotions run high and then the conversation shuts down. Whereas here, emotions aren't running high because we're not engaging them in that conversation. As long as my wife and I are doing what we should be doing. And of course, we're going down this path on purpose. And it's not manipulative. Some people like that as a manipulation. And I don't know, I think that's a poor word. These are my kids. I want to instill certain values. I want them to understand what we believe. And they can then interpret insert their own belief system or take this information and insert it into their own belief system over time. And then when I look at the outcomes, I can look at like my girls' peer group in how, our house is like the gathering place. Everybody comes over, all their kids and all that kind of stuff, their friends. And you can hear how their friends talk about money. And those conversations are being had. And you can look at the decisions that they're making, how they're spending money, which is really interesting because we're, I would say, in a more fluent position, than a lot of my friends' peer groups. We have a bit more money. And yet my kids spend more cautiously. And not because dad's pressing down on them, but they're just naturally more conscious about where they're spending their money than a lot of their friends who have less. So it's an interesting dichotomy because you would think just the opposite.
I actually just, the idea, this, you said the word manipulation, and I actually think the reverse. I think that to the extent that you can have these conversations in a way that are gentle, that they can hear, they're being manipulated already. Like they're on social media. I'm assuming they're on social media. They've got, the internet, they've got friends, the world is already telling them, buy more things lead to happiness. And everyone needs to have that. Spend authentically. What's important to you? You've got to do that important work first. You got to figure out what it means to you. And then that's the stuff you spend on. If it's meaningless, stop spending money on it. Like that's so important. I wouldn't think it's manipulation. I think it's fighting back. Like I think it's really, really important.
I don't feel it's manipulative, but I think to a certain lens, some people might feel that way, but I definitely don't feel that way. My job is to train these young children to become good adults. I've always thought about that. They're adults in training and I'm the trainer and I've got to guide them. And, they have independent thought, of course, as they move along, but my job is to instill the right value system and hopefully put them in a position to deal with the world as it is. And to your point is that with social media and all the data mining and everything, like we need to arm our kids with more ways to deal with all the stuff that's coming at them. We never had to deal with this growing up, right? You're a 90s child, right? Gen X, like we didn't have to deal with all this stuff. This stuff is like, we could be bored back then, right? You can't be bored now. And with all of the data mining, they're putting all these things in front of our kids saying, this is what you should have. This is what other people have. So that FOMO, you only live once, YOLO kind of stuff, that's in their face all the time. And if we're not there to help them deal with that and put up some armor against it,
it's lost.
And you're really seeing that in some of the problems that the younger generation are having adjusting to society because of some of those things coming at them.
So I warned you a little bit about this. I like to ask every advisor that comes on the podcast this question. In your opinion, what are the most important elements of an advisor's circle of competence? I know that there's things that the world sort of thinks about us, and we just talked a little bit earlier about returns and performance, and some people want that. But what is the most important thing that an advisor actually does for clients?
Well, I think the biggest area of competency is probably in their ability to communicate effectively with their client. When I say communicate, I don't mean talk at them, but with them to understand where the client's coming from. I'm taking for granted that we know what we're doing, that the financial advisor understands the technical side of his or her job. Now, that's a big if because a lot of advisors don't have a holistic view on money, right? So and this is again, not a criticism. Everybody can run their business the way they want. So there's plenty of advisors who their primary job in the way of engaging with clients is managing their investments. That's what this is my job. This is what I do. I'm going to help manage your money. We're going to get you great returns to get you on track for all your goals. Fine. That's totally fine. And I think if you're a man talking to a man, that message probably has resonance. I don't think when I look at my role and what we do for our clients, I don't think that's the highest point of competency that we need to demonstrate or exhibit. I think our competency in working with our clientele is having the ability to communicate holistically about the holistic needs of a client across the full spectrum of their entire life.
I'm going to push back a little bit. I think you're being far too generous and kind. I think that there's advisors and I'll ask the question this way. I think you're right. There's a lot of advisors that think that their circle of competence involves managing money, like investment selection, market timing, performance. What does the research say about an individual advisor, manager's ability to beat the market, to actually provide performance? What does the research say about that?
Oh, well, the research is pretty clear that that's a smokescreen. It's just not
Yes.
possible.
Okay.
Yeah. No, there's no way.
You're being too kind.
Well,
They
you know,
can't
hey,
successfully do it. They
I
can't. The promise is not possible.
overperformance is not consistently, not over a long period of time. You can get
Right.
lucky for a while, sure.
Right. Right.
And,
Okay.
I think that's part of the difference. Again, male and female, again, not right or wrong, but women don't care about beating the market. They
I know.
don't. A lot of men do. And if you could do it, great. If I could do that, right, consistently, I would have a line out the door. There'd be,
Has anyone ever done it consistently
yeah,
over time?
no,
Ever? Oh, okay. Just to be clear.
yeah, no, to be clear, it doesn't happen, right? I mean, the hedge
Right.
fund managers will tell you that they can do it, but I don't know. I don't think the proof's in the pudding.
We don't have to be nice to those advisors. We don't have to say that, it's a quality way to run your business. I think you hurt people doing that. And I'm fine saying it. I think putting performance first and talking about investment selection, marketing timing, I'll say it. You don't have to say it. I'll say it. I think we agree, but I'll say it. I think you're doing a disservice. So that circle of competence becomes, as you're saying, understanding the client and then helping the client plan to get from point A to point B, and then sort of keeping them on that plan. Does that seem a pretty good sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's basically understanding where's the client going, and then how do we get to that point B? And we're at point A. How do we get from point A to point B as efficiently as possible? That's the way I describe it to clients. Because what tends to happen is you think, and this is the terminology the language I use in a client meeting, and I think this does tie into your competency conversation, is the reality is that if you had a client and you said, hey, you need to get to San Bernardino, California, and you were in Cleveland, Ohio, how would you get there? If I said, get in your car and drive and get there, could you get there? Yeah, you probably could get there. Now, you'd take a bunch of twisty turns to get there, right? You might end up way off track, but eventually you'd make your way at least to California, and then it would take more time to get to San Bernardino. And that's a typical client's money experience. They manage money on their own. They go, they're making these decisions. They're investing in whatever their 401k plans and things of that. So they're directly going in, correct. But if you had Google Maps and you could put in San Bernardino from Cleveland, would you get there faster? Would you get there cheaper? Would you have more options once you got there because you had more time? Yeah. And so that's a good analogy. We put guardrails around clients' view of money, and we help them make better decisions. And so our circle of competency, it really starts with our frame of reference. Our goal, our objective isn't to be the best money manager. Not that that's not important. We're definitely not saying we're going to beat the market.
Of course not.
But we're saying that we're going to help you be as efficient and as smart with your money as possible, going from point A to point B, wherever that is. It could be college, it could be retirement, it could be building a legacy, it could be just getting out of debt, whatever it is. And that circle of competency is understanding the needs of the client and then understanding the world of finance in a holistic way that allows us to be an advisor in all of those areas. And I'll be honest, I think a lot of financial advisors don't want to do that work because it's really easy, relatively speaking. I don't think it's really easy to manage money, but relative to being a comprehensive financial advisor, it's far easier to just manage money than it is to be a comprehensive financial advisor. And I can get that. Why someone would say, I don't want to learn all that. I don't want to have to keep up with all of that. That's not important to me. I get that. But for me, I'm just the opposite. I wouldn't be in this business if I had to just manage money for clients. That doesn't get me going. But helping a client, becoming that trusted advisor, that confidant to them, that's motivational to me. It is more work, but I think it's also more rewarding and engaging work. So it works.
Yeah. And you've been doing this as long as I've been doing it. I'm doing it for 30 years. You build these relationships and people are actually really, I got to retire because you helped me out for the last 25 years. Like I just get shivers every time I think about some of those conversations. It's beautiful. There's a ton of noise out there. I like to ask every guest to simplify something for us. So I want you to put on your best advisor hat here. Pretend you're sitting in front of a woman who's just about to go through divorce. What is one thing that she should focus on that's going to lead to better outcomes through that divorce?
Wow, that's a big question. Part of it depends where they are in the divorce process. And I don't mean to shirk the question, because the thing about divorce is we think of it as like a single moment in time, but really it's oftentimes years and years in the making.
Yeah.
So depending upon where they are in that continuum, if they're very early in the divorce, even just thinking about divorce as a possibility, or early in the divorce process, it can change the way we answer the question. But on a more holistic point of view, I would say the thing about divorce is you've got to be your own advocate and you've got to be as strong as you possibly can through the process. And that seemed like that's a very murky, I don't know if it's a very helpful answer. But what I mean by that is you're going to be pulled in so many different directions in the divorce process. The problem with divorce, the really big challenge of it, it's not just one thing you have to contend with. So you have three major issues. You have the financial side of the equation, which requires its own set of advisors and understanding. It's a legal process. So you have to have your own set of lawyers and understanding of that part of the process. And then there's this huge emotional element that goes with it. And so if you're strong in two of those areas and poor in one, it could blow up the entire process. And so I think that most important, though, central to all of this is like your ability to manage all the stuff that's coming at you emotionally. Because you can go out, if you're good with yourself, right? If you imagine if you could be a non-emotional decision maker through this process, like I won't say Spock or like a robot or anything like that, but just like a very dispassionate, understanding and not letting the emotions overtake the moment. You have to do that work yourself and with conjunction, maybe a therapist, but you can hire out the work for the attorney. You can hire out the financial advisor work, but you can't hire out that work on yourself. And so there's been many occasions when I'm sitting down with women going through the financials and they're having a difficult time hearing me because of the emotions of the moment. And this is not a uniquely female thing. It certainly happens with men too, but we work predominantly with women. So that's my lens. But that's the biggest thing, because if you can be good with that and be as good as you possibly can, be as strong as you possibly can, it allows you to engage with those other elements and be a better decision maker and to advocate for yourself. Because what I found is that despite having these other professionals, you still need to advocate for yourself immensely.
Yeah. I've actually run into a few times when I've had clients who've gotten divorced and I've watched the divorce process unfold, and the man being very focused on the size of the assets they end up with. The woman just really wants the family home and will give up way more than she should give up in order to retain this one thing that she has this emotional attachment to. And it's just really, I think you're spot on to sort of level set your emotions so that you can look at everything really rationally. I mean, it's tough to ask. It's a big ask, but it's really, really important. So the flip side of that coin is, what's one thing that they're likely focused on that she should just let go of?
Another good question, and a big question at that, because it can vary so much. I think there tends to be emotional attachments that can overwhelm, all others. So you mentioned, this is maybe not the exact answer to your question. I think like the attachment to the family home,
Yeah.
the home that my child grew up in, where I raised my kids, the neighborhood, that can be a really big sticking point. And maybe it's a microcosm of a bigger issue, again, where the emotions take hold. But yeah, they'll give up assets, liquid assets, things that will help power their retirement and allow them to live their life today for the home, and to their own detriment. That happens quite a bit. We see that quite a bit. But just that general idea, like if you find yourself too emotionally attached, or I would look at the divorce process as a way to get even. Sometimes we see that as well. That it becomes just like, it's got to be exactly even or fair, because those are loaded words in the divorce arena. One of the things I found with divorce, it's kind of like the Wild West. It's unlike any other area in finance and well, I can't say law per se, but that I've come across, because normally the rules are X, and as long as you understand what the rules are, you can engage effectively within it. The rules really aren't there. It's kind of like, well, there's all these possibilities, and what possibility you avail yourself of is predicated upon how good you are at playing the game.
It's a whole list of trade-offs, right?
It very much is. And if you're not good at this, and a lot of people aren't, because it's a combative process. The divorce process is a combative, antagonistic process. The actual process itself, the legal process, is not designed to de-escalate. It's designed to escalate. You think about the most high-power charged times in a divorce case would be when you're litigating. It means you're in the courtroom. Those are the most high-powered, most highly emotional divorce cases, is where you're litigating literally the one side's trying to beat the other with their attorneys duking it out. That's escalating the tensions, whereas you really want to de-escalate so people can come to the table, try and find some common ground, and then be able to, as much as you can, part as friends. But the process really isn't built for that.
Yeah, it's hard for sure. At the end here, I like to loop back to some personal questions. If you could get the truth about any question, I can't give you the answer, but what would your question be?
You're talking just in general about anything?
In general, how long you're going to live, like will my son go to Harvard or whatever, whatever the thing, daughter go to Harvard, whatever question you have, what would you like to know? One answer.
I mean, the first thought that came to mind, honestly, was just, does God exist?
Huh,
I,
wow.
I mean, that's the plain, I mean, I think so, but, to have exact knowledge or proof, I think about what that would do to the world if we knew that God existed,
Huh. Well,
so.
wouldn't that remove faith? I have a legit religious studies degree, so I would talk about this for an hour and a half myself.
Well, the ramifications of knowing that knowledge, yeah, right, because then it removes the whole faith element. Then what's the point of God? I don't know. So it's a big question.
I've never gotten that question before. That's a great one. I love it. Finally, is there anything that people don't know about you, or maybe you've said to some people but they don't remember, that you really want them to know?
What we haven't discussed at all today was enlightenHer, and I think that's something that would be important for maybe the audience to hear, because it's somewhat top of my mind. So enlightenHer, what it is, it's a sister company of ours, and so as a financial advisor with Burning River, we can, as a company, we're a small boutique financial planning operation. We might be able to work with a couple hundred households. My daughter might be coming into the business, so we can expand that maybe by another 50 or 100, but it's not that many, right? Literally 200 to 250 households. And the reason for that is because our relationships are very, very intense, I guess. I mean, they're very labor intense. That's really, we get into the fabric of their lives. And so it takes a lot of time, a lot of understanding, working one-on-one. And because of that, we can't have that many clients, to provide the level of service that we want to provide. So it's very limiting. And when I think about that, it's like, I have 24 years in this industry and my business partner has 19. We have all this knowledge, and yet we can only share it with a couple hundred households, So it felt a little bit like there's something wrong with that, I guess. Like I felt we could do more. And so now I'm looking at my girls and I'm saying, I'm looking at how they're growing up, and I'm saying, well, I think they're on a better path. Like they have a stronger foundation to enter into their lives and to be strong with money and be empowered with money, because it's really important. If you're going to be an empowered person, you need to be empowered with your money. I don't think you can do both, or I don't think you'll be truly empowered if you don't have money on your side or your knowledge of money on your side. You don't have to be rich or anything like that, but you have to really know and how to engage with money. And so that became the genesis of this idea for enlightenHer, which is sort of a big tent. We want to take the knowledge that we have, and we can't do it one-on-one, but with the power of the internet today and podcasts and digital courses and those types of things, can we start to have a much larger footprint and impact on the world, take some of these learnings and get them out there into the world at large? And that's where enlightenHer comes in. So, enlightenHer is a burgeoning company. We're just getting started. We're just getting off the ground, a financial coaching and education company for women. We do have our first offering, I guess. Our first program is called Divorce Navigator. It basically is, it's about this topic of helping women understand the divorce process, whether you're at the earliest stages of it or you're about to step into it or knee deep into it. It really is designed to help women have a much better understanding of what this process is like. Because if you're going through a divorce, it's one of the most difficult, challenging, and far-reaching times of your life, because the decisions that you make there have threads that carry with you for the rest of your life.
Yep.
So that's really important to us right now, is to get the word out. We're trying to help make the financial services industry more accessible to women. We know the big Wall Street's not doing it, right? I mean, they're talking about it, but there's really not enough motivation for them to do it. So we're doing our small part to try and bring that information and knowledge out to the masses.
So how do people connect with you, and then how do people find enlightenHer?
Yeah, you just go to enlightenHer.com, and then there's a section that's geared towards just general finance. If you're just, a woman who's thinking about engaging with money and wants to learn a little bit more, there's a great, white paper on there, 9 money myths, talking about some money myths that women, kind of grew up with. So that's a great piece to look at. If you're going through divorce, there's a piece there, 12 steps about financial wellness and emotional well-being is on there as well. Sign up for the blog. I think it's a great real world information. What we try to do is write for women for where they are. And, we weave in stories and examples in real life, things that resonate with women. Again, having worked with women in this way for over 20 years, we have a pretty good understanding of the mindset of a woman. It is very different than the financial service industry understands. And if you're, someone who wanted to engage more directly, needed that real intense one-on-one type of, they can go to burningriverag.com and, our materials on there.
Sounds good. Ed, thanks much for coming on. We're going to make sure all that stuff's in the show notes. And I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Thanks for listening. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at mindful.money. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/mindfulmoney. We'll be sure to read those out on future episodes.